Two of the most technically advanced current-gen titles have just launched on PC, Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart and Remnant 2. These two games push features like ray tracing, advanced upsampling, virtualized geometry, and GPU-driven decompression, and can even prove taxing on powerful PC systems. So Valve's Steam Deck might seem incapable of a good experience in these two cutting-edge games, but both titles bear Valve's Steam Deck verified seal of approval. That means we should be able to squeeze enough out of both games to get good-looking visuals at reasonable frame rates, even within the limited performance of the Steam Deck's 15-watt APU. So can we truly get a good experience in these demanding titles, or do these games push past the limits of Valve's gaming handheld? Rift Apart is one of the most cutting-edge current-gen titles, so exactly how are we going to get it to run on the Steam Deck? The game is actually surprisingly quite scalable, so we don't need to cut visual settings down here too much at all, but we do definitely need to use some upsampling to get this title in a comfortable performance window on the deck. Here we have three options: AMD's FSR2, Insomniac's temporal injection technique, or Intel's XESS, running in its reduced quality DP4A path with support for non-Intel GPUs. Running all upsamplers in their performance presets here, I generally preferred the look of the XESS image, which is sharp and relatively free of visual artifacts. FSR2 suffered from more artifacting but maintained visual clarity, while temporal injection delivered a softer image with an artifacting level roughly between the other two options. On the surface, it seems like XESS is the right choice, but it did come with a decent performance penalty here, so I decided to stick to FSR2 as I didn't find the artifacting too offensive on the Steam Deck's display, though your mileage may vary. I used the performance preset to provide a stable set of resolution settings, though the dynamic resolution options do work very well if you want to try those. In terms of general visual settings, the medium preset is a good place to start, delivering a well-optimized combination of visual options. I also opted to increase the traffic density setting to high, which has a very minimal performance impact. When we measure these options against the game running with its lowest graphical preset, we do see a considerable performance loss, but I do think the various settings improvements are worth it here, and they still put us squarely within a 30 FPS performance window. When we look at the existing PS5 release in its performance mode, we actually aren't losing that much in terms of basic settings. There are clear compromises in texture detail and draw distance, but the rest of the settings aren't much of a downgrade from PS5. Of course, we are seeing big cutbacks in resolution and image stability, but the Steam Deck's small format display does help to mitigate those losses to some degree. Performance is generally quite good. We're averaging around 40 FPS with these settings, and are almost always staying above 30. With motion blur enabled, the game looks smooth enough, at least considering the host hardware, and it feels responsive on a controller. It tends to fare worst in firefights, unsurprisingly enough, with non-combat locomotion often hovering a little below 60 FPS, and frame times seem to be fairly stable, without many spikes to 50 milliseconds or above. Now, I did notice one or two times that the game dipped below 30 FPS here, which came during some of the more explosive combat moments, and certain shots of this small town area ran inexplicably poorly for some reason, with sub 20 FPS performance at times. But in typical play, this is a game that both looks good and can hit 30 FPS without much fuss. Framerate capping is a bit of a matter of personal preference on the deck. I don't think this game is particularly well suited for a 40 FPS refresh rate without cutting some settings back further, with visual settings more in line with the low or very low preset. Capping at 30 FPS is an option, either through the deck's built-in limiter or through the Mango HUD launch parameter tweak. There's also an option to engage half refresh rate VSync in the game's option menu, which also effectively caps the game at 30 FPS at a 60 Hz refresh. I tested the half rate VSync and system level 30 FPS limiter solutions, and both were quite consistent and delivered a stable 30 FPS output. I did notice some slight frame pacing issues every so often, but this seemed fairly minor. I chose to keep the game unlocked here to provide a good reference for how the game is operating under the hood, but I typically use one of these solutions for demanding titles when playing for fun. Of course, Rift Apart presents another potential performance problem: the loading. Sections of the game are built around ultra-fast level loading, featuring rifts that teleport the protagonists into different levels without any explicit loading screens. The Steam Deck lacks the PS5's CPU horsepower, SSD bandwidth, and decompression hardware. So can we get a decent experience here? Well, sort of. The deck completes each portal load in this section in roughly 4 to 5 seconds, which is about 2 or 3 times slower than the PS5 version appears to take. This disrupts the flow of each sequence, which features animations that effectively mask any loading on a more powerful system or the PS5, but don't hold up as well on the deck. It's not too offensive, I'd say, but it's not a seamless experience. The entire sequence here, from the camera cut to gameplay to the first frame of the cutscene after the fade to black, takes about 30% longer on the deck than PS5. Blizzard Prime features a similar performance delta, with the PS5 offering a near instant swap between the two landscapes, and the deck lagging by a few seconds each time. But that's using the Steam Deck's internal SSD, which offers an effective read speed of about 1.6 gigabytes per second on my 256 gigabyte deck. What about this fairly typical microSD card, which delivers a read speed of only about 90 megabytes per second when inserted into the deck's microSD slot? This is actually less bandwidth than a typical laptop hard drive has to offer. It's pretty awful, to be frank. Each portal here takes about 10 seconds or so, which seriously dampens the flow of gameplay. It's still playable, I suppose, but it falls far short of the intended experience and feels very awkward. The Blizzard Prime crystal loads also prove painfully slow. Most games on the Steam Deck run just fine off of microSD, but the intense loading demands here bring Rift Apart to a standstill. That also probably means that the 64GB Steam Deck with eMMC storage with about 300 megabyte per second read speeds has somewhat compromised loading as well. Using a microSD card or hard drive with a low-end system really stretches the limits of the Rift Apart experience. With Rift Apart installed on the internal SSD though, it does basically pass muster on the deck, and seems like a perfectly credible Steam Deck verified title. It's definitely a demanding game, but we can pull some very good visuals out of it as long as we stick to a 30 FPS refresh and make heavy use of upsampling technologies. As a portable experience, it works quite well too, with short action-packed levels and bright colorful graphics. So Rift Apart proves surprisingly well suited to Steam Deck class hardware. But what about Remnant 2? Remnant 2 is a very heavy game on console platforms, rocking internal resolutions as low as 720p on PS5 and Xbox Series X. So hammering this title into shape on Valve's low-power handheld is a bit of a tough task. First of all, we do need to employ some form of upsampling here, just like with Ratchet and Clank. For some reason, the FSR2 in this title looks pretty bad, with a messy resolve on almost any kind of movement. It's not clear if the developers are using an early FSR2 version or if there's some other issue, but the results here are quite poor. Intel's XeSS, again running in its DP4A path, fares much better. It does feature some artifacting and disoccluded image detail, but it's perfectly presentable on the Steam Deck's display. General graphical settings do need a bit of attention as well. The lowest settings preset seems like a natural place to settle for this game, but this option sees hugely pared back visuals, with poor shadow rendering, sparse foliage, and zero apparent ambient occlusion coverage. We really need to step up to medium settings or above to get a good image. Unfortunately, that does come with a performance cost that clocks in at about 3 FPS or so with XeSS in performance mode. Further settings enhancements beyond medium come with a similar performance penalty, with ultra settings hovering around 22 FPS. We do need to open up a bit more headroom here to hit medium settings, which in this case means cutting back resolution further. 960 by 540 with XeSS in balanced mode produces a soft, though inoffensive image, with a reasonable enough appearance on the deck's LCD. The Unreal Engine 5 powered visuals here do prove quite heavy and very GPU bound. So this feels like the best option to keep frame times in check while preserving the game's basic visual makeup. With those settings compromises, we can get some okay performance out of Remnant 2. Typical gameplay falls in the 30 to 40 FPS window, which is reasonable given the complexity of the rendering. But the game does tend to suffer from some frame time inconsistency, with dips to 50 milliseconds and larger stutters as well. We do see some sub 30 FPS frame rates as well in more demanding moments, which seems to be at its worst in some of the denser interior areas. I played a few online matches to push the game as much as possible. Remnant 2 generally ran with a pretty similar performance level as in solo play, albeit with a rougher frame time readout with more spikes. I did notice that the game's frame rates could tumble down to the mid-20s, though most gameplay fared better. Performance was definitely a bit worse here, though not dramatically so. I did notice a few graphical issues that I wasn't able to work around as well. There's a small white artifact in the upper left of my capture that appeared regardless of the settings that I used on the Steam Deck. And some areas were excessively dark and difficult to make out even when I turned up the brightness a bit. The console builds notably do not share this issue. Remnant 2 doesn't fare all that well on the Steam Deck. We have to make some big resolution concessions here, and the game's performance level is a bit too shaky to truly feel comfortable. It's far from the worst recent release that I've played on the deck. Returnal and Hogwarts Legacy are substantially more compromised, but the overall experience isn't a good one. It's definitely still playable here, but I'd really recommend enjoying Remnant 2 on a more powerful platform. The Steam Deck perhaps isn't the machine that I'd choose to play either Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart or Remnant 2. With advanced modern titles, you do have to make some substantial visual compromises to get decent deck performance, and these games are no exception. That said, Rift Apart is in reasonably good shape here, with pleasing graphics and acceptable frame rates, as long as you run it on a 256GB or 512GB model on the internal SSD. It's not the full-fat PS5 or high-end PC experience, but it's a satisfying outing for a portable system. Remnant 2 fares substantially worse, requiring a big resolution cut back and still suffering from substandard performance. This isn't great stuff, and probably isn't a very good sign for upcoming UE5 titles. Epic's advanced Lumen lighting technology is totally absent in Remnant, and yet the game still struggles to hold it together on Valve's handheld. The Steam Deck is a great machine that can deliver PS4 class visuals in a mobile form factor, but performance in demanding current-gen software is hit or miss. Ratchet is certainly in the former category, while Remnant 2 pushes the portable powerhouse a little too far. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at digitalfoundry.net for exclusive and early access content, and to get in touch, use Twitter. Thanks for watching.